It was 1925 that was to see the birth of 602 Squadron, and it was here, over these monuments to the dead, that the first hesitant flights were made by 602's embryo auxiliary pilots. If you can't read the names on the tombstones, you're too high. These had been the words that Flight Lieutenant Dan Martin had used to urge his young pilots even lower on their approach to the flying field at Renfrew, which was to be 602's home for the next 8 years. In the distance on the other side of the M8 motorway, which is Glasgow's main artery to the south, lies what was once the proving ground for many a hopeful weekend flyer. It now lies a desolate wasteland, the sounds of the de Havilland, the Avro, the Fawn, and finally the Wapiti having long since faded into history. This is how it looked in 1926, and a very proud day for the squadron in uniform for the first time. The airport from above, showing the original grass flying fields, the large hangars were ideally suited for 602's de Havilland DH9s. Squad Leader Lowe, 602's commanding officer for the first 6 months, made way for the first auxiliary SEAL, Captain J.D. Latta, who during the First World War had flown the SE-5 Scout with the Royal Flying Corps. Squadron Leader Fulton followed in 1927, seen here second from the right in the picture. Also to join at this time were David McIntyre, Douglas Farquhar and the Marquis of Clydesdale. July 1927, the King and Queen arrive at Copelaw Street to officially open the squadron's long-awaited headquarters. Situated in Glasgow's south side, it contained everything that the previous temporary HQ had lacked. 602 were fast becoming of age. Meanwhile at Renfrew, the flying training continued as 602's pilots perfected their skills on the de Havilland DH9 and the little Avro 504. But gradually a new aircraft was being brought into service, the Ferry Fawn. Here we can see McIntyre flying one. The 30s were to bring in another new type, the Westland Wapiti. Standing in front of one, second from the left, is Douglas Farquhar, who was destined to lead 602 into war. The Wapiti had a less than complimentary name by the men of 602. 1932, and it was now the turn of the Marquis of Clydesdale to take command of 602 Squadron. The flying days at Renfrew were numbered now, as the new purpose-built airfield at Abbotson's neared completion, the move finally taking place at the end of January 1933, and the flying fields here at Renfrew fell silent as the noise and the bustle of the Auxiliary Air Force Squadron receded. But 602 were destined to return to their first home, and in less than 20 years. But during 6 of those years, they would once again experience the horror of war. But in 1933, 602's commanding officer was about to reach never-before-attained heights in aviation history. The Marquis and 602's flight commander David McIntyre can be seen here preparing for their historic flight over Everest, which took place on the 3rd of April 1933. Two specially prepared Westland aircraft had been shipped out to India and had been meticulously rebuilt and checked. Also, specially electrically heated flying suits were needed to combat the intense cold at the 34,000 feet height of the summit. Finally, everything was ready and the historic flight began. It was 8:25 as the two lumbering Westland aircraft took to the air and set course for their objective. The final 50 miles were hazardous for the two machines as they fought against the rising westerly winds, but it was Clydesdale who was lifted on his final approach to the giant mountain by an enormous updraft and became the first man to fly over the mistress of the world. Time was to move on swiftly for 602 Squadron. Soon it was 1936, and many new faces began to appear at Abbott's Inch. It was near the end of that year that Hector McLean, a successful lawyer with a practice in the heart of Glasgow, helped to swell the ranks of 602. Seen here in his garden, Hector, now in his 80s, remembers well The date he first joined Glasgow's own.
November 1935. Yes. That was as soon as I had graduated at Glasgow University. I joined the squadron. The operational type was a Hawker Hart light bomber, and we were just switching to Hawker Hinds, which was much the same.
Donald Jack, educated like Hector McLean at Glasgow University, tells of his first days with 602.
I'd actually joined the squadron in 1936, but I'd applied to join in 1935 because I'd been invited to a garden party that 602 Squadron was having on Empire Air Day, which was a sort of big flying display at many RAF stations at that time. And I'd been very much taken with the idea of flying. It's really the first time I'd come in close contact with it, but I loved the sound of the aircraft, the smell of the exhaust, and everything that. It really hooked me.
Archie McKellar accepted by 602 at the same time as Donald Jack. Both would be awarded their wings on the same day in 1937. On the left of this picture, taken at annual camp at Rochford in July 1937, is George Pinkerton, who was destined to fire the opening shots of the Second World War. Dunlop Urey. He would soon write his name into the history books. On the left we see David McIntyre, who was commanding officer of 602 at that time. In the face of growing international tension, Glasgow staged the Great International Exhibition of 1938. 602 were there, with Douglas Facker now in command. The exhibition had a twofold effect on the populace. Firstly, they could forget about the gathering storm clouds over Germany, as that nation once again prepared for war. Secondly, they could stare in awe as their own Auxiliary Air Force squadron gave their best. 602 had been there at the beginning, performing a fly-past as the King opened the great exhibition, and at the close, performing a spectacular night display with Pinkerton, McKellar and Webb illuminated in the cones of searchlights over Ibrox Stadium, their silver hinds beautifully silhouetted against the night sky. The unmistakable sound of a Supermarine Spitfire. 1939 and 602 saw the arrival of the first of these masterpieces. The inspired creation of R.J. Mitchell, they were destined to arrive just in time to meet the onslaught of Germany's Luftwaffe. Hector McLean remembers well his first flight in a Spitfire, which didn't go quite according to plan.
I took off in, it had two pitches, fine pitch and coarse pitch. Fine pitch was for taking off, and coarse pitch was for flying around normally. But without actually having done it, you couldn't really tell which you were in. And I took off in one of these, in fine pitch, thought I was in coarse pitch, and went back into fine pitch, and straggled into the air. But before I knew where I was over Bears Den. It was quite an experience. The thing was so fast, I hadn't realised just how fast it was. Doesn't seem fast now, but as the speed of a hind was about 130, top speed, 30, perhaps 150 top speed, it was quite a difference.
Donald Jack recalls his first experience of the legendary fighter.
We were actually the first auxiliary squadron to get Spitfires, and I think probably about the third or fourth squadron in the RAF to get them. We're very lucky. Oh, it was marvellous. I've never really experienced anything quite like it, and I flew my first one in beginning of June in 1939, and it was quite superb. Faultless. The thing was, at that time, it was just the airplane as it had been designed. It had no guns in it at that time, no armour plate, which weighed a terrific amount, no radio, no oxygen, nothing. It was just a plain shell of an airplane, and it was gorgeous. And you could do aerobatics anyhow you wanted, and it just would respond to perfection. It's a beautiful airplane. Later on, it put 8 guns in, then armour plate, and various other things, long-range petrol tanks, all sorts of things. But it was still a lovely aeroplane, really beautiful.
Hector McLean and Donald Jack's opinion of the Spitfire in 1939 would very soon be shared by the whole of Fighter Command in the 6 years that lay ahead. As in Germany, Hitler was about to take the first steps that would ultimately lead to war between Britain and Germany. Germany had been rearming and growing stronger throughout the 1930s under the fanatical dictatorship of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. 1936 had saw his armies victorious in the Spanish Civil War. The invasion of Czechoslovakia quickly followed. A major benefit from the Civil War with Spain was that it had given Germany's Luftwaffe an opportunity to train its air crews in active service conditions. At that time, Germany was the only nation in the world to possess battle-trained airmen. Poland was to be Hitler's next objective in his plan of conquest. Just 18 days for Germany to defeat the Poles. September the 3rd, the British Prime Minister tells the nation that an ultimatum given to the German government has been rejected, and consequently Britain is at war with Germany. RAF Drem, a former flying training school situated on Scotland's east coast. It was from here that 602 Squadron were destined to fly into history, as they fired the opening shots of the Second World War in the October of 1939. Today the former RAF base lies silent and forlorn, the vibrant sounds of those early days of the war having long since evaporated into the mists of time. A time when young men, excited at the prospect of combat, had waited eagerly for the shrill ring of the alarm bell. However, Drem was far from the ideal operational base, as the confines of the airfield's perimeter were restricted to high-performance aircraft such as the Spitfire, which resulted in many takeoff and landing accidents. But in 1939, as the squadron posed happily for this photograph with the then commanding officer Douglas Harker, the inherent problems at Drem would be overcome. The important thing then was the ability to make early contact with the enemy. And for this one singular reason, Drem was ideally suited. as it would provide 602's pilots with a minimum interception time for contact with the enemy aircraft. Hector McLean, who in the autumn of 1940 would suffer an operational injury which was to sadly end his flying career. However, in 1939, 602 would not have long to wait for their first contact with the enemy. Donald Jack, standing first on the left, remembers that first conflict with Germany's Luftwaffe.
The actual raid itself took us by surprise because radar cover only went up about as far as Dundee. I think the Germans knew this, and they came in a great sweep round Dundee and then attacked Rosyth and the Forth Bridge from the north. So they were on us really before we knew, and I don't think anyone was about them. Well, maybe some of the earlier pilots who were up earlier intercepted them over Rosyth, but they were on their way home when I met my few just south of Kirkcaldy.
It was Pinkerton, McKellar and Webb who had been the first to attack the enemy bombers over Rosyth. A furious battle ensued as the Junkers aircraft tried desperately to bomb the British warships in the waters below. A sustained attack by Pinkerton on the lead bomber could have only one ending, as a murderous gunfire reached the doomed aircraft. The 603 Squadron, who had also been involved in the battle, engaged a Heinkel bomber, which they eventually shot down into the sea near Port Seaton. As right section of 602 flew over the Bass Rock on their approach to Drem to rearm and refuel, Donald Jack, still high above the Firth of Forth, was about to engage the enemy once again.
I was just turning away to go back to Drem when another Ju-88 just passed right in front of me, right through my sights. But I couldn't do anything about it because there was no more ammunition there, but that was it. It was short and sharp.
The following day, the newspapers were full of reports of the battle. However, for the pilots who had been involved in that first aerial conflict of the war, it was a time to reflect on what had been for them their first experience of combat in the air.
I'd fired almost, first time I'd ever fired my guns in anger, and really only probably about the second time I'd ever fired the guns at all was so short of ammunition. So there was very little practicing. So I eventually fired all my ammunition, and there were three offers, and we got this Ju-88 down, flying very low on the sea, and one engine was giving a bit of trouble. But I had no more ammunition, so it wasn't really a battle. And they just came in and raided.
Battle or not, 3 of the German aircraft were shot down by the combined efforts of 602 and 603 squadrons. Later that day, Flight Lieutenant Gifford of 603 Squadron wrote these words in his logbook: "Got a Hun over Port Seaton." Of the warships that the Germans had attacked, only the Mohawk had suffered any casualties. A near miss had killed her captain as he directed returning anti-aircraft fire from the bridge of his ship. Interestingly enough, the German report on the raid stated that a successful attack had been carried out on British warships in the Firth of Forth, the first incident of German propaganda over Britain, which in the years that lay ahead was to be a viable weapon on both sides. Guided by 603 Spitfires to the spot where they had shot down the Heinkel, HMS Gurkha proceeded to pick up 3 of the aircraft's 4-man crew. The surviving crew members of the Junkers that Pinkerton had shot down were also picked up by rescue craft. For the once elite airmen of Germany's Luftwaffe, who had flown supremely confident into that first conflict over British waters, only a 6-year internment in a Canadian prison of war camp now lay ahead for them. Historically, it had been the first confrontation of the war over Britain, and a considerable triumph for the 2 Scottish auxiliary squadrons. But for the 2 German airmen killed during the battle, their fate had been to be buried far from their native land, on a foreign shore. The day after the 4th raid, Drem was alive with activity, as the ground crews prepared the Spitfires for further battle. One of these men was Bert Simpson, a metalworker, who had first joined 602 Squadron at Abbotssinch in May 1936. Bert recalls that autumn day in 1939.
It was quite an interesting, first off thing, and of course they're all got a bit kind of, in the fact that you were successful and didn't lose a pilot, But, I see the picture I've got here. Pinkerton was one of the principals involved in it, and McKellar. But, as I say, now, being in the workshops, you weren't so involved with the pilots, really, at that stage. Later on, when we were mobile and second TAF, you were, but when you were on a permanent station such as Drem, you were in the workshops. But when we went mobile, you were all mixing in and doing everything,
Another ground crew member was Charlie Murray, who also joined 602 at Abbotssinch in the May of 1937. Apart from his normal duties with the squadron, he also played the pipes with the regimental band. Charlie also remembers that first air battle, and one pilot in particular.
I was a wireless operator mechanic, so I had access to the radio communication which was taking place, and I was able on some occasions to hear the conversations of the pilots. And I don't know whether it was on that particular raid or not, but there was one raid where I picked up Marcus Robinson, and I heard Marcus Robinson saying "tally ho" in his best public schoolboy accent, and I knew then that he had sighted the enemy and he was going in to try and shoot him down.
October 1939. On that day, 602 and 603 Squadron were again to share in another notable first, as the Luftwaffe returned to the 5th of Forth. The giant cantilever sections of the magnificent Victorian structure of the Forth Rail Bridge would have made an inviting target on the enemy bombers' aim sights. But as with the previous raid on the 16th of October, the bridge had not been the enemy's objective. Indeed, Hitler had ordered that only military targets which were clear of the shore could be attacked. 2 reconnaissance Heinkels had been identified firstly by the primitive radar of the day, and then again by observers on the ground. One was circling over the ships at Rosyth, and inland the other enemy machine was performing the same manoeuvre over the town of Dalkeith. The anti-aircraft guns were swiftly brought into action as the bombers circled menacingly overhead. In the air, a section of 602 Spitfire sighted a circling bomber, and Archie McKellar led the first attack on the Hankel. Firing from only 200 yards, 2 3-second bursts of murderous fire rigged the aircraft from nose to tail. 3 Spitfires of 603's red section then arrived and also attacked the stricken Hankel. Again and again the attack was pressed home. There was no return fire from the enemy, their guns silenced by McKellar's first pass, and the sustained attacks from 603 Squadron. The shattered Hanko had continued to fly, dropping lower and lower, her crew trying desperately to keep her in the air. But the end was inevitable. The Hanko had come to rest on moorland at Kidlaw, 6 miles south of Haddington, close by to the village of Humby. The pilot of the bullet-riddled aircraft had made a remarkably good crash landing, despite having had half of his control shot away by the attentions of the 2 Scottish auxiliary squadrons. The perspex nose of the Hanko afforded a clear all-round vision for the pilot and his observer, but it also afforded the attacking fighters with an equally inviting target for the 303 Brownings. The pilot of the Humby Hanko, as it came to be known, had experienced that vulnerability, as 602 and 603's bullets had smashed into his cabin, badly wounding him, but miraculously missing his observer, who survived the battle and the ensuing crash. The Hanko was dismantled and transported to Farnborough, where a detailed report was made on Hitler's Wonder Bomber. When its findings were finally released in 1941, they were of little consequence, as Fighter Command's pilots had by then dispatched hundreds more to a similar fate. The pilots of 602 Squadron could feel justifiably proud of the October battles with the German Air Force, which had not only served as morale boosters for the country, but they had also been an impressive display of how weekend flyers had reassured Britain and given warning to the Luftwaffe that they were prepared. In those early weeks of the war, Sandy Johnson and Archie McKellar had quickly settled into a daily routine at Drem, and with the station then on 24-hour readiness, the morale was high throughout the whole of the squadron, as they waited for the almost daily appearances of the Luftwaffe and the order to take off and intercept the enemy.
Blue section out there.
Their patrols had frequently took them far out to sea in search of the enemy. On one of these occasions, Hector McLean, accompanied by Dunlop Uria and Foom Strong, intercepted 2 Hanko floatplanes on a mine-laying mission. They each attacked the lead plane in turn, which had stood little chance against the combined firepower of 602's guns, and it was very quickly dispatched to a watery grave. As the Spitfires returned to Drem with their gun patches blown away by the fire of the aircraft's 8 Brownings, the individual ground crews would gather round their aircraft and their pilot, anxious to hear of any action. Jackie Gibson, an aircraft mechanic, was one such ground crewman, who also remembered the arrival of another enemy at Drem, the Scottish winter.
We went to Drem in the first winter of the war, and many will remember a particularly cold winter at Drem. But the conditions were not too bad, you know, considering it was wartime conditions. But the trouble was that during the winter at Drem, we'd go up during the night to run up the aircraft to keep them warm and turned over, you know. That was the problem, all during the night, just so they could take off.
March 1940. The squadron posed proudly behind their then commanding officer Douglas Farquhar, who only a few days earlier had brought down a Hanko 3 bomber. The DAFC had quickly followed that action, and in early March he was promoted to wing commander. Shortly afterwards, after 13 years' service with 602 Squadron, he left to take command of a fighter station in the south. George Pinkerton, in the centre of the picture, was 602's next commanding officer. Awarded the DAFC for his actions during the 4th raid, promotion had followed quickly, and he too had been sent south to command a fighter squadron. In March 1940, he came home. As the year progressed into May, The Squadron Spitfires began to have personalised touches added to their drab grey paintwork, some appropriate to a Scottish squadron, others not so. This example has an effigy of Reich Marshal Hermann Göring on its side, whose air force was now concentrating its efforts in France in support of the Wehrmacht, as they slowly pushed the beleaguered British expeditionary forces into the sea at Dunkirk. After a lengthy meeting with his chiefs of staff, an order was given by Göring to bomb the British troops trapped on the beaches, with the aircraft that spearheaded the many successes in Spain and Poland, the Stuka. Over 400,000 troops were rescued from the shambles that was Dunkirk. In Britain, the new Prime Minister Winston Churchill spoke to the nation.
We are girt about by the seas and oceans, where the navy reigns, shielded from above by the prowess and devotion of our airmen. We await undismayed the impending assault. Perhaps it will come tonight. Perhaps it will come next week. Perhaps it will never come.
The Battle of France is over. The Battle of Britain is about to begin. Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duty. And so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.
As Britain held its breath and waited for the German onslaught to begin, at Drame it was business as usual for Pinkerton and Johnson as they took off on a night interception patrol. In 1940, night flying was in its infancy, and 602's pilots had been striving to perfect what was in a Spitfire a hazardous operation. Johnson was to be lucky that night. Victor to a position over Musselburgh, he had been in the perfect attack position as the searchlight beams converged on the Heinkel bomber. The shooting down of the Heinkel had been another first for the squadron, as it had been the first night success by a Spitfire. In August, the news that they had been waiting for finally arrived. The move south was on. Since July, the Luftwaffe had intensified their attacks over the English Channel, and 602 had waited impatiently for the call south. Their patience rewarded, they turned into the wind, opened their throttles for the last time, and took off southwards. In just over 3 hours, the squadron flew into this little corner of England.
But it was in a sector called the Tangmere sector, and we were in a little satellite airfield called West Hampnet.
Sandy Johnson, sitting middle of the picture, now 602's commanding officer, had led his men into West Hampnet, but their welcome had been less than encouraging. Jackie Gibson remembers their arrival.
43 Squadron was there. They had taken a bit of a hiding. And they had told us they thought we'd only last a week. But we lasted right up to October, to the end of the Battle of Britain.
A few hours after 602's arrival, the Hurricane Squadron had taxied out and taken off. Their destination, Drame. As the Hurricane pilots headed off for the period of rest and recovery, West Hampton was alive with activity as the armourers prepared 602's aircraft for the coming conflict. The ground crews had been briefed by Johnson that the squadron's pilots could be flying up to 4 operational sorties a day, and that the Spitfires must be rearmed, refuelled and turned around as quickly as possible during a battle. No one complained. This is what they had waited for. They had not waited long. The radar station at Poling had picked up a series of blips on its primitive radar screen. It showed that a formation of enemy aircraft were forming over the French coast. This information was then duly passed through Fighter Command's filter system to finally arrive at West Hampton. And so, for 602 Squadron, the Battle of Britain began. With Johnson on leave that day, Dunlop Urey had been in charge of the squadron. His own Spitfire unserviceable, he had led 602 into battle in a brand new replacement aircraft. It was to be its first and last operational flight. As 602 took off, the same pattern was being repeated throughout Fighter Command's airfields as 5 more squadrons took to the air. Over 350 enemy machines were now drawing towards their targets, one of which was the Poling radar station. 602's 12 Spitfires would arrive as the dive bombers began their attack. One of the first of 602's pilots to open fire was Ginger Wall, who shot down 2 Ju-87s in rapid succession. Trailing smoke, Ginger Wall's Spitfire had been seen heading towards the shore. The Messerschmitt 109s, which had outnumbered 602 Spitfires by 8-1 that day, descended upon the squadron's snarling fighters, and friend and foe in turn began banking, twisting and diving in an attempt to escape each other's deadly hail of fire. Suddenly the sky was clear, the battle over. Ginger Wall's Spitfire lay on the shoreline. It would never fly again. He would. West Hampton, Dunlop Urey had by a miracle landed what was left of a replacement Spitfire. After shooting down 2 of the German dive bombers, he had then himself come under fire from the escorting 109s, whose 2 MG FF cannons packed a powerful punch, as witnessed by the damage seen on the fighter's side. Urey had been lucky. Although badly injured, he had lived to fight on. His Spitfire, however, with an operational life of only 25 minutes, would never fly again. But neither would 10 of the enemy's aircraft. Donald Jack recalls an encounter a few days later with Germany's other fighter aircraft, the Messerschmitt 110.
I was flying a number 2 to Sandy Johnson, the CO, and we got up to 27,000 feet, 28,000 feet over Southampton. And I was feeling pretty groggy at the time when we intercepted a raid coming in, protected by 109s and 110s. So I made a sort of rather feckless attack on the bombers, and then pulled away and saw these 110s, and I thought, well, I can just do a tight circle inside them, because they were circling nose to tail like a lot of puppy dogs. So I had a good swipe at them, but I couldn't really see if I hit any, because I was flying in the opposite direction from them, if you understand.
Yes.
Then I sort of beat it as hard as I could.
Hector McLean was not so lucky.
I was attacked by a 109 who shot my leg off, and it was hanging just loose in its shoe, and I had to obviously get back before I died through loss of blood. So that I managed to do. I went to Tangmere and landed there and was taken to hospital. Up to that point I'd been a flight commander since the our flight commander was knocked out, Dunlop Urey, on Eagle Day, that's the 15th of August. And I was flight commander from the 15th to the 26th. And that was the end of my short command.
Due to his injuries, McLean had made a wheels-up landing at Tangmere. Jackie Gibson remembers well the events that followed as the ground crew helped the badly injured pilot from a Spitfire.
Well, I remember one particular incident when Flying Officer McLean crash landed, and I was his fitter. He lost a leg in that accident, and I always remember going down to the crash and him telling everybody what to do. He wouldn't even listen to the MO, and he didn't want an injection.
Such was the spirit of the men of 602, and the Spitfires could take it. X-4187 was repaired and continued in service right up to the end of the war.
It was the finest fighter aircraft we had. It had everything. Easy to handle, wasn't too big, it could be manhandled with 2 or 3 men. And the Merlin engine was really out of this world.
Spitfire was the most beautiful machine that's ever been made.
There was during the Battle of Britain, they didn't make any major repairs in the aircraft. They just left them and the new aircraft came to the squadron.
The Spitfire, to me, and I think most people, the most beautiful aircraft that was ever manufactured. Everything about it, the lines of it, and it was a thing of beauty, not a thing of war.
September 1940, and the German offensive turns from the RAF's airfields onto Britain's capital. London was about to be plunged into a new dark age.
Away to the east, we saw a most enormous armada of aircraft, quite extraordinary, on a very wide front, stretching as far back as you could see. It was just like a great migration of geese. So we swallowed a bit of that and bit our nails, and Sandy eventually sort of got a plan of attack going. We got dug in, and it was there, it was on that particular raid we saw Archie McKellar in action. He was down at, I think, Biggin Hill with 605 Squadron. He had been given command of that, and the Hurricane Squadron. And we saw this Hurricane Squadron way to our left, diving headfirst at the leading formation aircraft, and gave them an awful dusting. And this huge armada, in front of it anyway, just wobbled. This extraordinary attack that they'd had, and they lost some of their leaders, and of course that was devastating, but at the same time they did get through to the docks, and that was really the first of the bad burning of London.
They lost Roger Coverley and Harry Moody in September. No one saw them fall or die. They found Coverley's body a few days later. He had burned terribly, the fighter pilot's worst fear. To burn was the worst way to go. Moody and his Spitfire were never seen again. Slumped in his cockpit with a dead hand at the controls, he had become another victim of the cold grey waters of the English Channel. And so it went on, day after day. 602 Spitfires would rise to meet the onslaught of the German raiders. But because they were based inland from the coast at West Hampnet, they had a vital advantage over the enemy.
squadrons that were stationed all around London, Biggin Hill, Kenley, Hornchurch, Northolt, so on, they were having to climb up very much under the enemy raids, whereas we could come from 60 miles away to the west and get some height up. Height was all important. So it may be for that reason that our casualties, our own losses, were much less than some of the squadrons. We were also very well placed for Southampton, a lot of raids in Southampton, and the way out to Portland and so on. So we had a very big parish. The early days in August and September and so on, the days were interminable. They went on forever, from an hour before dawn until dusk. And a day was like a week. You couldn't remember at the end of the day what you'd done in the morning.
In the towns below, the populace would look up in awe at the aerial battles unfolding high above them in the autumn sky.
There's one coming down in flames. Somebody's hit
And like every other nation in 1940, the people of Britain were glued to their radio sets and listened eagerly to the daily news bulletins.
And there he goes, smash! There are 3 Spitfires chasing 3 Messerschmitts now. Oh boy, look at them going! And there's a Spitfire just behind the first 2. He'll get them. Oh boy, I've never seen anything so good as this.
Throughout those early weeks of the Battle of Britain, recurring problems with the Spitfire's radio equipment had kept the wireless mechanics busy, but an advance in technology was about to change all that.
The highlight of my job at West Hampton was changing from out-of-date communication equipment to up-to-date communication equipment, which was in fact frequency modulated. BBC talk about it nowadays, but in those days it was known as VHF. A special tutor was sent down from Duxford to teach me how to set up the new sets so that they would be suitable and ready to be fitted to the aircraft. This work took several weeks on my part, and when the work was completed, the sets were ready, all the changeover equipment took place on one night. All the aircraft had all the equipment that they had removed and all the new equipment installed in one night. And so far as I know, and the following day, when the fighters took off, there was not one failure. This, to me, made the Spitfire absolute magic as far as I was concerned.
West, sugar 1187, sugar 1187, 4810.
Intercept, right, 40.
They lost Sergeant Spragg on that day.
He got shot down, I think it was around about September 1940. He'd been married 1 month, and the curator of Tynemere Museum sent me a photograph of he and his wife coming out of the church after they'd been married. He went missing, and his wife came up and sat for almost a month on the roadway that separated where our workshops were and the airfield, and sat there for almost a month waiting. Spragg, what had happened? Was he prisoner of war or what? His body was washed up at Brighton and they had a military funeral. And that was one of the tragedies. Well, it was multiplied. Young pilots, 20, 21, married for a very short period, and the wives left like that, you know. And this, I can see that lad's face yet as a young man. There were things like that that you don't forget.
October, and they still came in over the English Channel like hornets, though by this stage in the battle their sting had been greatly subdued by the bravery and determination of the RAF pilots. In answer to a question raised by Reich Marshal Hermann Göring to his airmen as to how he could help them to defeat the British Air Force, General Adolf Galland, a veteran of combat, had replied, "Give me a squadron of Spitfires." Such was the legend, but for the men of 602 Squadron, now flying up to 5 operational sorties a day, the cost was sometimes too high.
Another time we'd been over Southampton, and we were returning to West Hampnet when there was a raid came up on the table, and Sandy sent me and a Sergeant Wall over to intercept, and just sort of east of Brighton we saw this Dornier coming south towards us, so we got onto it, and it was really pretty well a sitting duck. And we both had a good go at it, and it went into the sea about 10 miles out, I suppose, from Brighton. And we were making our way back together to West Hampnet when he suddenly just sort of started losing height and wouldn't reply on the radio. I called him up and asked what was happening, and I sort of turned around and flew round him to see what was happening, and just went straight in. Not vertically, just flew into the thing just at an angle. I don't think there was much of the aircraft left, but it was the most inexplicable thing.
We lost one or two very good chaps.
The bond between all of us was very close. I mean, there were some wonderful fellows then. But the person really who I saw most through that stage was Finlay Boyd, who made a great name for himself, shot down many aircraft. And Finlay and I flew a lot together, and we had been friends before the war. We had a marvellous time at night too, and particularly as the days got shorter.
All you needed was the price of a pint to get into a pub, and that was you finished, because the civilians were. Next thing there's drinks up in front of you. If you had an Air Force uniform at that period, you were treated, even ourselves, you know, ground crew, they treated you like heroes, you know. That it was an indescribable period, the atmosphere. It was a sad time, and it was the happiest time of really the war. There were a great atmosphere of comradeship. How a common, you know, what do you say, common, I can't just get a word for it, brings people together. Common danger, and it brings people together.
That danger returned on the 29th of October as the Germans began what was to be their final attack of the Battle of Britain. Radar had picked up the formations of Messerschmitt's Early, and control had then vectored 4 squadrons of Hurricanes and Spitfires to strategic positions. 602 was one of these squadrons. There were 12 of them now, sitting high at 30,000 feet, waiting. Then the 109s arrived, and it all began. And then suddenly the sky was empty, the kaleidoscope of noise and action gone, and the slow realization that they had all lived through it once again. 602 Squadron had suffered no loss of pilots on that day, but 8 of the enemy did not return to their bases. They had fallen to the guns of Glasgow's own. Two days after that last great battle, officialdom had drawn the line on the Battle of Britain. It had been but a brief period from July to October 1940, but a period in which a handful of young men had held back, by their skill and determination, the onslaught of the greatest aerial armada in history. The following day, Archie McKellar was killed, flying. Archie had been awarded the Distinguished Service Order just 2 days earlier. The official communique had read, "His outstanding courage and determination was a magnificent inspiration to his fellow pilots."
O God, with proud and thankful hearts, we remember before Thee all those who in the Battle of Britain counted not their lives dear to them, by their valour saved this our land from the power of the enemy.
But by a bitter twist of irony, Archie McKellar, DSO DFC in Bar, was to be denied inclusion in the Roll of Honour for the Battle of Britain because he had died 8 short hours after the official end of the battle. May 1941, a 110 takes off from Augsburg in Germany. At the controls, the Deputy Führer Rudolf Hess was about to begin one of the strangest mysteries of the war. Hector McLean, now a fighter controller, recalls the events of that night.
The fighter control was done from a house called Rosemount, just north of Pestrick Aerodrome. And it had only been operating for about a month. And I was on watch as controller, and it was about 10 o'clock at night, and there was a call from a policeman, I think at Eaglesham, saying that a German captain had either crash landed or parachuted, and they had him at Eaglesham. And they wanted to speak to he wanted to speak to the Duke of Hamilton. So I said to the sergeant, well, you better leave it with me. I'll see what I can do. So with some difficulty, I got hold of His Grace, who had been CO of 602 Squadron, so fortunately I knew him. So anyway, I told him about this, and he said, what's all this, Hector? He said. And I told him what it was, and he said, what does he want to see me about? I said, well, I don't know, he won't say. And then he said, what do you think I ought to do about that? I said, I think you better go and see him.
I have a new track here, range of 455 miles.
Earlier in the evening, we'd had a hostile